She was Hollywood's ultimate blonde bombshell, famous, fearless, and always in the spotlight. But behind the beauty and the headlines was a life that was unraveling fast. The scandals were relentless, and the company she kept in her final days was even more dangerous. When Jayne Mansfield's life came to a heartbreaking halt with a tragic crash that still haunts Highway 90 to this day, the public was told only one version of what happened. For years, the truth was buried under rumors and red tape, and her autopsy report was kept out of the media. But when it finally came out, it told a very different story, one that was far darker, disturbing, and almost unbelievable. What exactly happened to Jayne Mansfield that night? You'd never believe it, because what the coroner found inside that report was nothing like what the world expected. Jayne's early life and journey to stardom. Jayne Mansfield wasn't just another Hollywood blonde bombshell. She was brilliant, bold, and burning bright in a world that never truly saw her. And long before the tragic crash that ended it all, Jayne was already fighting battles behind the spotlight that may hold the key to what really happened. The most painful part of her story isn't just about how she died, but about how she lived and what was ignored until it was far too late. She was born Vera Jayne Palmer on April 19, 1933, in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. From the outside, her early life looked like a quiet and ordinary one. However, fate had other plans. When Jayne was just 3 years old, her father, Herbert Palmer, died suddenly of a heart attack. He collapsed right in front of her. That traumatic moment stayed with her for the rest of her life. Her mother eventually remarried, and the family moved to Phillips, Texas. And it was there that Jayne began to change. She fell in love with acting and began imitating movie stars like Shirley Temple. At a time when other kids were learning how to ride bikes, Jayne was dreaming about cameras, costumes, and lights. She knew she wanted to go to Hollywood, but getting there was the hard part. After graduating from high school, Jayne married her first husband, Paul Mansfield, at just 16. A year later, she gave birth to their daughter, Jayne Marie. Most young women would have settled into a quiet domestic life, but not Jayne. She wanted something bigger than being a wife. She enrolled at the University of Texas at Austin, majoring in drama, and threw herself into her studies. Later, she transferred to the University of California to continue her training. And while others still saw her as a beautiful young mother, Jayne was already preparing for the next stage of her life. She learned how to use her voice, how to work the camera, and how to move like a star. That was the beginning of her transformation. Jayne dyed her hair platinum blonde. She changed her walk, her talk, and eventually her name. Vera Jayne Palmer became Jayne Mansfield, a name so carefully crafted that it couldn't be ignored. Her big break finally came in 1957 with Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter. The film wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural moment. Jayne played a satirical version of the attractive, over-the-top blonde Hollywood was obsessed with. But unlike others who had played this role before her, Jayne was in on the joke, and she played it up, leaned into it, and stole every scene. The success of that film opened doors everywhere. Suddenly, Jayne Mansfield was the talk of the town. But behind the public image of the bubbly blonde bombshell, Jayne was something else entirely. She had an IQ reportedly above 160. She spoke multiple languages, played the violin, read classical literature, and understood exactly what she was doing. The media immediately labeled her the smartest dumb blonde, and Jayne wore the label like a crown. She turned heads, yes, but she also turned the industry upside down. Every red carpet she walked, every publicity stunt she pulled was a masterclass in self-promotion. She didn't wait for Hollywood to hand her a crown. Instead, she built one herself. By the early 1960s, Jayne had become a household name. She had 5 children, starred in major motion pictures, headlined in Las Vegas, and even had a mansion called the Pink Palace that became the stuff of Hollywood legend. She wasn't just famous, she was unforgettable. Jayne Mansfield had done what few could. She turned ambition into power, and she built herself from the ground up. But not everything that sparkled in Jayne Mansfield's world was gold. Behind the flashing cameras and the glittering gowns something else was quietly unraveling. The world enjoyed being entertained by her, but very few ever saw what it cost her. And some of those costs wouldn't come to light until long after her final curtain call. The struggles behind the glamour. On the surface, Jayne Mansfield had it all. She was famous, rich, and beautiful. But behind closed doors, her life was anything but glamorous. The same Hollywood that once worshipped her curves and charisma began to drift away as trends shifted and a new generation of stars emerged. The blonde bombshell era was fading, and with it was Mansfield's place in the spotlight. By the mid-1960s, Jayne's once thriving career was in serious decline. Major studios stopped calling, and the leading roles dried up. Offers were few and far between, and to make matters worse, the ones she did get were often low budget or overseas. She went from movie premieres to nightclub stages, doing anything to hold on to the fame that once came so easily. But the spotlight came at a cost, and Jayne was paying in more ways than one. Her lavish lifestyle, designer wardrobe, flashy pink mansion, and constant need to appear wealthy took a massive financial toll. She earned well in her prime, but she spent even better. Debts piled up, legal fees grew. She was a star trying to maintain a Hollywood image with no Hollywood budget. Her personal life wasn't faring much better either. Jayne married 3 times and divorced 3 times. Her most famous relationship, with former Mr. Universe Mickey Hargitay, started with passion and publicity but ended in bitter fights and public spats. Each marriage brought new complications, and each divorce left more emotional and financial scars. And then there were the affairs and the tabloid rumors that never stopped. She was linked to a string of powerful men, including politicians and entertainers. Most infamously, her name was tied to President John F. Kennedy, though details of that alleged relationship remain murky. Some claimed she used these connections to stay in the news. Others argued that she was manipulated by the very power brokers who helped make her a star. Behind the scenes, the pressure was building. Jayne struggled with depression, anxiety, and substance use. The constant demand to appear perfect, to smile, pose, and perform took a serious toll on her mental health. As the roles faded and the money vanished, the reality of her situation became harder to hide. Desperate to remain relevant, she began accepting gigs that were once beneath her. Small theaters, nightclubs, and overseas films with no distribution deals in the United States. At one point, she even performed in a burlesque show, an act that would have been unthinkable during her Hollywood peak. But by then, it wasn't about pride anymore. It was about survival. This was not the Jayne Mansfield the public thought they knew. The pink convertibles and witty interviews masked a woman drowning in pressure, heartbreak, and regret. Her smile was still camera-ready, but behind it was someone who was losing her grip on everything that once defined her. And yet, she never gave up, even as the industry turned cold. Even as the headlines mocked instead of praised, Jayne kept pushing forward for her children, her pride, and perhaps her belief that another big break was just around the corner. Until one night, on a lonely stretch of highway in Louisiana, the curtain fell in the most brutal, unthinkable way. The tragic accident that took her life. The night of June 29, 1967, was quiet, humid, and uneventful for most people driving along Route 90 near Slidell, Louisiana. And what happened in the early hours of that morning would send a shockwave across America, leave a permanent scar on Hollywood, and become one of the most talked about tragedies in pop culture history. Jayne Mansfield had been traveling late at night with her lawyer and companion Samuel Brody, her driver Ronald B. Harrison, and 3 of her children, Mickey Jr. Zoltan, and a young Mariska Hargitay, who was just 3 years old at the time. They had spent the evening in Biloxi, Mississippi, where Jayne had been scheduled for a TV appearance. After wrapping up her commitments, she and her entourage began the long drive back to New Orleans, where she had other engagements waiting. They were riding in a 1966 Buick Electra, a sleek and powerful car, but no match for what lay ahead on the dark Louisiana highway. As their car moved steadily along Highway 90, they approached a large semi-truck that had slowed behind a truck that was spraying mosquito repellent into the gutters. The chemical suddenly made visibility a problem, and the driver of Jayne's car didn't see that the semi-truck in front of them had slowed down. Before he had any time to react, they plowed into the rear of the semi-truck at high speed. The upper portion of the car went straight under the trailer, peeling off the top of the vehicle in an instant. The crash was devastating. Jayne Mansfield, who had built an entire career around being seen, was killed almost instantly, along with her driver and her companion. The scene was gruesome, and reports from first responders described it in extremely graphic terms. And yet, somehow, amid the wreckage and horror, a miracle occurred. In the back seat, strapped in and sleeping, were Jayne's 3 youngest children, and all 3 survived the crash. Mariska, Zoltan, and Mickey Jr. were injured but alive. The survival of those innocent children would be one of the few glimmers of light in an otherwise pitch-black story. Mariska Hargitay, too young to remember the details, would carry the emotional and physical scars of that night for the rest of her life. A small zigzag scar on the side of her head would become a silent reminder of the moment she lost her mother. She would later go on to become a beloved actress in her own right, known for her strength and resilience, qualities she probably forged by surviving that unimaginable night. When news of the accident broke, the public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Headlines screamed the tragedy across front pages. Rumors, often sensational and tasteless, spread quickly. Television anchors were visibly shaken and reported on the shocking loss of one of Hollywood's brightest personalities. Fans wept. Some didn't even believe it at first because it was all too sudden and too surreal. Hollywood, too, was stunned into silence. Jayne had been a fixture in the entertainment world for over a decade, and while her star had dimmed in recent years, her presence had never fully disappeared. Her death was a reminder that fame didn't make you immortal. If anything, it made your end more public, more scrutinized, and sometimes more tragic. Actors, directors, and former co-stars released statements, many of them reflecting not only on her talent, but also on the humanity that existed beneath her flashy exterior. People who had laughed at her exaggerated persona now mourned the woman who had created it. The pain was real, and the loss was deeply felt. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Jayne Mansfield's accident wasn't in the headlines or in the tears of fans. It was in the changes it brought about on the roadways of America. You see, the type of accident that killed Jayne, where a car slides underneath the rear of a large trailer, is now known in transportation safety circles as an underride collision. And her accident became one of the most public and gruesome examples of why something had to be done. In the years that followed, safety advocates pushed for changes, and eventually, federal regulations required that all semi-trailers be equipped with what are now called underride guards, a steel bar installed beneath the rear of trailers, designed to prevent smaller vehicles from slipping underneath in a crash. It's not an exaggeration to say that Jayne's tragic death quite literally helped save lives. The regulation became known informally in some circles as the Mansfield Bar, though the official designation never included her name. Still, it's a sobering tribute to a woman whose legacy ended up touching not only the world of entertainment, but public safety as well. For many, the idea that a movie star's tragic ending could influence traffic laws seemed strange, but that's how impactful her death was. Even decades later, people continue to talk about that night on Highway 90, not just because of who she was or how she died, but because the contrast was so stark. A woman who had once floated across movie screens in shimmering gowns, adored by millions, met her end on a dark, forgotten road in Louisiana, far from the red carpets and camera flashes she had once called home. But even as the world mourned her sudden death, something strange began to happen. Whispers grew really louder, and headlines started asking uncomfortable questions. What really happened that night on Highway 90? Was it just a tragic accident, or was there something more? Behind the official reports and public grief, a darker narrative was beginning to take shape, and it wasn't long before details of her death were filled with mystery, speculation, and secrets Hollywood never wanted exposed. Conspiracy theories surrounding her death. By the time the news of Jayne Mansfield's violent car crash hit the papers, it was already being called a tragedy. But in the weeks that followed, as the headlines turned cold and the funeral wreaths began to wilt, the story took a darker turn. People weren't just mourning her death anymore. They began whispering about it, because according to the rumors, Jayne Mansfield hadn't just died in an accident. She had been cursed. The rumors centered around one man whose very name seemed to summon shadows. Anton LaVey. LaVey wasn't just some back-alley magician or fringe oddball. He was the founder of the Church of Satan, a man who wore black capes, painted his home all in red and black, and declared himself the high priest of hell. And in 1966, Jayne Mansfield was seen at his side. In fact, photos of them together still exist. LaVey in his iconic dark robes, with his sharp goatee and eerie stare, and Jayne beside him, beaming her signature Hollywood smile, looking every bit the blonde bombshell in a setting that felt more horror film than red carpet. For some, it was just another publicity stunt. After all, Jayne always knew how to get people talking. But for others, it was something much more sinister. Whispers began to circulate that Jayne had become deeply involved with LaVey, not just as a curious visitor, but as a full-fledged follower. Some rumors even claimed she had been ordained as a high priestess in his church. Although this part was never confirmed, the connection was enough to ignite one of the most chilling conspiracy theories of her time. And at the heart of that theory was a curse. The theory claimed that Mansfield was romantically involved with her lawyer and companion, Sam Brody, a man known in Hollywood for his aggressive temper and his tendency to cause trouble wherever he went. According to LaVey's own claims, he and Jayne had a close relationship, and he warned her to stay away from Brody, who he said was bringing chaos into her life. But Jayne didn't listen, and this made LaVey furious. The theories maimed that in anger, he allegedly either ritually cursed Brody or made a dark prophecy about his fate, and weeks later, both Brody and Jayne were dead, killed in the same horrifying crash. For some, that was too much of a coincidence to ignore, and the theory gained traction quickly. In a decade already steeped in occult fascination, the idea that a Hollywood starlet had become entangled with dark forces didn't feel so far-fetched. People pointed to Jayne's increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to the crash, her obsession with staying in the spotlight, the strange circles she ran in, the eerie photographs with LaVey, and the public flirtation with satanic symbolism. But Jayne Mansfield wasn't the only celebrity linked to Anton LaVey. Sammy Davis Jr., one of the era's most charismatic performers, was also rumored to have flirted with the Church of Satan. So were other musicians, actors, and even directors who were drawn to LaVey's anti-establishment message and the theatrical thrill of the occult. LaVey, for his part, never confirmed or denied the rumors. In fact, he seemed to encourage them. He gave interviews implying that his curse was real, that he had warned Jayne, and that fate had done the rest. Whether he truly believed it or just knew how to feed a legend, no one can say for sure. But his words only deepened the mystery. Those who dismiss the theory say it was all just coincidence, a tragic accident, nothing more. They point to the poor visibility that night on Highway 90, the chemical fog from the mosquito truck, and the failure of safety standards on the semi-truck, saying, it was all bad timing, they argue, that a perfect storm of bad decisions and unfortunate circumstances led to her tragic death. But those who believed saw something darker. They looked at the crash photos and saw symbolism. They analyzed the timing and came up with patterns. They even listened to LaVey's warning and interpreted it as a prophecy. And it raised further questions, not just in Hollywood, but in the general media. Was Jayne Mansfield truly cursed, or was she simply caught in the storm of her own chaotic life that had been spiraling for years? Because even now, decades later, Her death still doesn't sit right with people who still claim that her passing didn't feel like just another tragic accident, but that there was something too dramatic, too violent, and too cinematic about it. In the years that followed, the legend only grew. Conspiracy theorists added new twists, secret pacts, and even lost diaries and hidden messages in her films. Others claimed that Jayne herself had dabbled in occult practices, that she'd become obsessed with astrology, palm readings, and mysticism in the final months of her life, that she believed in signs, and that maybe she saw it coming. We may never know how deeply Jayne Mansfield was involved with Anton LaVey, or whether he truly cursed Sam Brody, or whether anything supernatural played a role in what happened that night. What we do know is that a brilliant, beautiful woman died too young, and the strange company she kept in her final days made sure that her death would never be remembered as simple, but as suspicious and sensational. But even with all the rumors of curses, secrets, and the whispers of the occult, nothing could prepare the public for what came next. When the autopsy report was finally unsealed, it didn't just confirm her death. It uncovered details so graphic and so unsettling, they were kept out of the media for years. These weren't just medical notes, they were the final, brutal chapter of a life lived in the spotlight and ended in darkness. The autopsy report's disturbing findings. For weeks after Jayne Mansfield's sudden and violent death, the world clung to headlines and rumors, each more chilling than the last. But nothing stirred the public's imagination quite like what they thought they knew about what happened to her body that night. There were whispers of her body being decapitated in the accident, and hushed mentions of substances in her system. But at the end of the day, the truth was shrouded in half-facts and tabloid hysteria. But finally, the autopsy report was released, and it stripped away the glamour and spotlight and laid bare the final, brutal truth of what happened to Jayne Mansfield that night on Highway 90. And even in its detached medical language, the report told a story more horrifying than any tabloid headline ever could. The cause of death was clear and immediate. According to the medical examiner, Jayne Mansfield died from severe craniocerebral trauma. In simpler terms, her skull and brain had suffered catastrophic damage due to the violent collision. When her car slammed into the back of the tractor-trailer, the front of the vehicle crumpled like paper, and the roof peeled back with brutal force. Sitting in the front seat, unrestrained, Jayne had no protection, no time to brace for the impact, and certainly no time to escape. What made the injuries even more horrifying was the precision with which the report laid them out. There was no gentle language, and it was made obvious that the trauma to her body was massive, instant, and fatal. But this was also where myth began to muddy fact. For years, people believed that Jayne Mansfield had been decapitated in the crash. It was one of the most widely circulated rumors about her death. It painted an image so grotesque and so unforgettable that it became inseparable from her legacy. Newspaper reports at the time even hinted at it, fueling the narrative by describing her wig, which was found on the dashboard. But the autopsy finally set the record straight. Jayne Mansfield was not decapitated. That gruesome detail had been a false and tragic exaggeration born from the chaos of the crash scene and the public's hunger for drama. What actually happened, according to the coroner's findings, was that the impact of the crash caused immense damage to her face and head, but it didn't lead to decapitation. The wig had been flung forward by the force of the impact, creating an image that became seared into the memories of first responders and reporters alike. The myth lived on, but the truth was far more human and just as heartbreaking. But the report didn't stop there. Toxicology results revealed that Jayne had alcohol in her system at the time of her death, with a blood alcohol concentration that raised eyebrows. It wasn't sky-high, but it was enough to be noticeable. Along with that, traces of barbiturates, a common sedative that was prescribed in the 1960s for sleep and anxiety, were found in her system. Whether they had been taken as part of a regular routine or in a moment of stress, No one could say for certain, but their presence painted a more complex picture of Jayne's final hours, one that hinted that she may have suffered from a troubled mind in her final days. Then there was the detail about her seatbelt, or more accurately, the lack of one. It seems almost unbelievable now, but in 1967, seatbelt laws were still in their infancy. Many cars didn't have them, and even when they did, wearing one wasn't yet the norm. Jayne Mansfield, like so many others of her time, had not been wearing hers. Had she been buckled in, some experts believed the extent of her injuries might have been reduced, maybe even survivable. But unfortunately, without it, her body was thrown forward with an unstoppable force. The combination of unrestrained momentum, blunt force trauma, and the compact space of the Buick she rode in left little room for survival. The autopsy also documented minor injuries to her children, who had been sleeping in the back seat. Miraculously, they survived with just cuts and bruises, protected by their position in the car and sheer luck. It was the kind of miracle that made the tragedy feel even more surreal. Jayne was gone in an instant, while her children, especially the youngest, little Mariska, lived on, unaware in the moment of just how much had been taken from them. Experts later weighed in on the findings, and they all agreed on one thing: the violence of the crash had been total. There was no time for suffering, no drawn-out final words, just impact, silence, and then the slow spread of chaos. The image the autopsy painted was so raw that many in Hollywood never truly spoke of it. Close friends and family tried to preserve Jayne's dignity by focusing on her life rather than her death. But the rumors, the conspiracy theories, and the gruesome details wouldn't go away. But the truth remains that they never do when someone dies so young, so suddenly, and so publicly. And in the years since, many have revisited that report, not just out of morbid curiosity, but in an effort to understand the truth and to strip away the myths and get to the real woman behind them. Jayne was a woman who drank to cope, who took sleeping pills like so many of her peers, who didn't wear a seatbelt because, back then, no one thought they needed to. A woman who suffered immense trauma in her final moment, but who did not deserve to be remembered by the worst photo taken at the crash site. She deserved more than the headlines, more than the whispers, and certainly more than the myths. But what do you think? Did the alleged satanic curse have anything to do with what happened to Jayne? Tell us in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.